lesson that Israel has learned in the Middle East in the last year is that international guarantees are more than worthless, they're actively harmful. Let's remember, southern Lebanon was supposed to be demilitarized by a UN force called UNIFIL. It ended the 2006 war and was meant to make sure that Hezbollah wouldn't be there and wouldn't have arms in southern Lebanon. And right under their noses, Hezbollah built a monstrous army with 200,000 rockets. I went just yesterday to see some of the weapons that the Israeli army has confiscated. So Israel is going to insist on some very clear, tough international guarantees to make sure that if peacekeepers do go into this UN buffer zone, they're not going to be as good as an umbrella that folds up at the first sight of rain.
The sudden fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria has led to more uncertainty in the Middle East as rival powers look to seize on the chaos left in his wake. Israel has carried out dozens of airstrikes across Syria and has approved plans to encourage the expansion of settlements in the occupied Golan Heights. The UN has called for an urgent de-escalation by Israeli forces and for them to withdraw from the Golan buffer zone. We can speak now to Eylon Levy, former spokesperson for the Israeli government. Good morning.
Hello, good morning. Merry Christmas.
And to you. Benjamin Netanyahu has obviously recently visited the newly seized area of Mount Hermon in the Golan Heights, and he said that Israel will stay until another arrangement is found that ensures Israel's security. Realistically, what could that arrangement look like?
Sure, I'll explain, but if I can just a moment bring you an important update that happened overnight. Just before 2 a.m, the Houthi pirates in Yemen fired a ballistic missile at Tel Aviv, sending millions of people running for shelter in the middle of the night. We've seen an escalation in the last week. There was a ballistic missile that hit a school in Israel, another one that hit a playground, and the Yemen front is heating up. Actually, the Syria front, of all the fronts that Israel has been attacked on since October 7th, is the one that I'm most optimistic about that will be stable. To your question about what is happening in Syria. Before the fall of the Assad regime, there was an agreement between Israel and Syria that created a buffer zone. That buffer zone was meant to be enforced by a UN peacekeeping force. But when the Assad regime fell, that UN peacekeeping force fell as well. The peacekeepers were attacked by armed groups, and the Israeli army, in fact, stepped in to protect the peacekeepers from the jihadists who were attacking it. What Israel has done now is to take control of a very narrow buffer zone, and it's saying that it will remain there until an alternative international force is able to make sure that jihadists and other threats aren't able to come close to Israel's border. Now, how realistic is that? Well, I'm not tremendously optimistic, because the lesson that Israel has learned in the Middle East in the last year is that international guarantees are more than worthless, they're actively harmful. Let's remember, southern Lebanon was supposed to be demilitarized by a UN force called UNIFIL. It ended the 2006 war and was meant to make sure that Hezbollah wouldn't be there and wouldn't have arms in southern Lebanon. And right under their noses, Hezbollah built a monstrous army with 200,000 rockets. I went just yesterday to see some of the weapons that the Israeli army has confiscated. So Israel is going to insist on some very clear, tough international guarantees to make sure that if peacekeepers do go into this UN buffer zone, they're not going to be as good as an umbrella that folds up at the first sight of rain.
But there are certainly people who suspect that when you talk about, we need to find another security arrangement for the Golan Heights, that is essentially shorthand for perpetual Israeli occupation.
Well, we're talking about a very, very narrow buffer zone, much smaller than the large swathes of territory that Turkey has taken in northern Syria, for example, to establish a buffer zone of its own. We're talking about the creation of a narrow buffer zone because the lesson that Israel learned from October 7th, this is the lesson that everyone's taking in Israel, is we cannot allow terrorist armies to mobilize on our borders. At the end of the day, these questions are not abstract, they're very real. The question is whether terrorist armies are going to be in a position where they can invade and perpetrate another kind of October 7th massacre. So Israel doesn't want to have to mobilize a large standing army and reserves and to keep forces in Syria. We would much rather there be international forces capable of doing it so that, our soldiers can go back to their day jobs. But unfortunately, the lesson that Israelis are taking since October 7th is that we can only rely on ourselves. What Israel would like to see is the creation of a real buffer zone that would keep hostile forces away from the border.
But it's more than just a demilitarized buffer zone, is it not? I mean, Israel has also approved the expansion of settlements in the Golan Heights. That's not a demilitarized buffer zone.
No, that's not the demilitarized buffer zone. We're talking about two separate areas. There is the Golan Heights, territory that Israel captured from Syria in 1967 in the Six-Day War, an area that the United States has since recognized as sovereign Israeli territory. And there Israel is calling to beef up the civilian presence in territory that has been Israeli since 1967.
Although we should say the UN, the EU, and most other countries around the world consider the Golan Heights to be illegally occupied.
Of course, the United States disagrees. But that is very different from the buffer zone. We're talking about a narrow strip only a few kilometers wide in which Israel is positioning forces to make sure that the al-Qaeda offshoot that just took over Syria cannot approach the border. There was a separation of forces agreement, right? There was an agreement that was meant to keep Israel on the Israeli side of the Golan Heights, the Syrian army on the Syrian side. And that deal was predicated on the assumption that there was a Syrian army committed to upholding it and an international peacekeeping force able to enforce it. And both of those assumptions have collapsed since the Syrian army has fallen. There was a power vacuum that was created. And in that power vacuum, by the way, Israel has taken the opportunity to send in warplanes to destroy Assad's chemical weapons, to destroy Assad's ballistic missiles, to destroy Assad's other strategic weapons, to make sure that they cannot fall in the hands of terrorists and make sure that the transition that happens now in Syria is not one that is going to endanger the wider Middle East because terrorists are suddenly able to get their hands on weapons of mass destruction. And this is one of the steps that Israel is taking for the sake of regional peace and security.
If Ahmed al-Shara, the leader of HTS, the leader of what appears to be the new regime in Syria, does end up entrenching his power in the country, how do you think that regime will approach the issue of the Golan Heights, especially given, Ahmed al-Shara previously went by the name of Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, Jalani meaning Golan, so presumably he still very much considers it Syrian territory.
Right, well, on the one hand, Israelis are very skeptical. The deputy foreign minister called al-Jalani a wolf in sheep's clothing. Let's remember, until a few days ago, he had a $10 million US bounty on his head because the organization he leads is a recognized terrorist organization. On the other hand, I do think we have an opportunity here for more stability in Syria, and I'll tell you why. In recent years, Assad was one of the Iranian regime's closest allies. He allowed his territory to be used to transfer massive weapons to Hezbollah. He allowed Syrian territory to be used to attack Israel. It's one of the 7 fronts that Israel has been attacked on since the October 7th massacre. And Israel has always wanted to detach Syria from the Iranian axis in order to isolate the Iranian regime and push its proxy forces away from the border. There is a possibility that the new leadership in Syria is looking around and saying, hang on, we've just been fighting a civil war for 13 years. The last thing we want is to pick a fight with Israel. Certainly when you look at what has happened to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to Iran's other proxy armies, there would be no benefit in picking a fight with Israel. So I would hope that the Syrian leadership will look at the situation and say, if we choose a policy of at least neutrality, look, ideally we should have peace, right? But if the new Syrian government says we choose a policy of at least neutrality, we're going to keep away from the Israeli border. We're not going to threaten Israel with attack. We're not going to allow the Iranian regime to use Syrian territory to transfer weapons to Hezbollah. Then we can have security along that border, and Syria will hopefully be able to rebuild and pick itself out of the horrors of the last 13 years.
Eylon, appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Eylon Levy there, former spokesperson for the Israeli government.